So we're going on with the next session today on the second day, on Tuesday, 2nd of June, here from Latvia, Jūrmala, Criminalise Nuclear War Systems Conference. And this session will be about the fabulous conference that happened, arranged by Helen Caldicott Foundation in the United States. That is a conference on nuclear war issue, and then I will go into the subject of trade agreements, and there we will have a look of Noam Chomsky's take on this global issue, how the planet has been formed, systemic structures are being formed by trade agreements. Though that is, of course, a bit into the subjects of law, which we will have on Thursday, on the 4th of June. Nevertheless, here it comes. So, Helen Caldicott Foundation, you can find on internet, HelenCaldicottFoundation.org, and as you come into it, it pretty spectacularly informs about the US and Russia possessing 93% of the world's approximately 16,300 nuclear weapons, while about 6,000 await dismantlement around the world. 4,000 are operationally available. An estimated 1,800 remain on high alert, ready to launch on short notice. The US nuclear fleet rests not only at 12 sites in 11 US states, but also at 6 sites in 5 different European countries. And Russia is more opaque about the locations of its nuclear weapons, but is estimated to have permanent storage at 40 locations within the country. So how do we find the conference on her webpage? Please follow up here. So on her HelenCaldicottFoundation.org, you go to the right upper corner that says Symposia. And there you click on Symposium, the Dynamics of Possible Nuclear Extinction. Took place on February 28th to 1st of March this year at New York Academy of Medicine. And here it's not easy either, because this is just location and daily order. But here you have to go to this string. The event will be live streamed, and there you will find all of the presentations videoed. And it is not that easy here either, so you have to click on play. And here you get the player that will show you the first session of...
Apparently he is here, but I don't know where.
But you can scroll down here, and it's a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous conference with marvelous list of speakers. And just by clicking on this blue, you get exactly the talk of the speaker, which I didn't... It took me a while to find out, because it hangs up if you just click on this. After 2 sessions, it doesn't show anymore. But if you keep scrolling down and clicking on each talker, you will get the whole conference videoed on video. So this is a major happening that Helen Caldicott has managed to arrange this conference. We are very lucky that they have done it, so we don't have to do it. And they are very worried about what's going on. And they have really gotten the full picture of talkers in many aspects of the systems of nuclear war. I have to say that the most interesting, systemically, from the property and power systems of view, I recommend to check Mike Löfgren's speech. You see, Mike, can you zoom in Mike Löfgren? A former congressional staffer and author of Anatomy of the Deep State, the merger of corporations and the US government as an underlying cause of the current nuclear situation. This man has been working in the United States government for decades, and he has really seen how it has merged with the corporations, and he has now published a book, Anatomy of the Deep State. So he's calling these structures that other president of the United States has called military-industrial complex. He calls them the deep state. So it's not the state that we can see officially with these names, but there is another state within the state, the deep state, that makes all decisions. And all these sort of visible in media processes are just like a cover-up for the real operation, for the deep state manager procedure. And so go and see Mike Löfgren's presentation, because he really brought the truth up forward, and all the other talkers are just magnificent too. Especially I liked, for example, Max Tegmark, who is actually a professor of physics from Sweden. He is a specialist in artificial intelligence and risk of accidental nuclear war. And generally, I will start though to give you a glimpse of Helen Caldicott herself.
Apparently he is here, but I don't know where. Okay, we better start. I have sad news to tell you on the live stream. Don't do a Reagan. Now, I set up this conference basically because I read an article in the Atlantic Monthly some months ago quoting Stephen Hawking, and we were hoping that he'd give a few opening remarks, but he's been very ill lately. And Max Tegmark, who is one of our speakers this morning. And they were talking about artificial intelligence, and it's moving very, very fast at the moment. Elon Musk talks about that too. And they're very worried about it, and yet they can't seem to stop themselves keeping going. And it's said that within about 10 or 20 years, but maybe shorter, that computers will be autonomous, that they may be able to reproduce themselves, that you can't, I'm saying this, program morality or conscience into a computer, and that they're worried that computers themselves could initiate a nuclear war. When I read that, I thought, my God, as if things aren't bad enough with the United States and Russia militarily confronting each other now for the first time since the Cold War, computers could take over our world in that way. So that's why I set the conference up. And I'll just read to you how I think, and I see the planet as a patient because I'm a physician, and clearly the planet is in the intensive care unit now, acutely, critically ill. Whether or not the planet will survive is really difficult to ascertain, but the prognosis looks poor. So as a physician, I'm trained to assess a patient by taking a detailed medical history, then conducting a careful physical examination, which is what we will do today in the nuclear weapons area. This is followed by a series of laboratory tests which guide me to a diagnosis. Appropriate treatment that follows after the illness is diagnosed and the cause is defined, and that's what we'll be assessing today and trying to analyse. It is also imperative that the main disease is attended to and not to concentrate on peripheral issues such as treating an unrelated complaint, like treating a boil on a patient's nose and the patient is dying of metastatic carcinoma, which is really significant now and appropriate really to what's happening in the world today. Therefore, I look at the world and its ongoing pathology from a similar perspective. There are many serious issues facing the world at the moment, but it's necessary to triage the most pertinent threats to our very survival, as it's easy to be diverted by lesser threats. Manic denial, fashions, gourmet foods and the like, and you can see this happening in New York all the time. As a physician, I would therefore say that the ever-present threat of nuclear war is an ongoing existential risk which threatens the extinction of almost all planetary life. This threat is even more acute because most people and politicians have become immune or are unaware of this threat, or alternatively are practicing psychic numbing. That would apply at the moment to the New York Times, let me say. There's a reporter here, take note. The truth is that Russia and America possess 94% of the 16,400 nuclear weapons in the world. The US maintains its first strike winnable nuclear war policy, and both countries have raised their nuclear arsenals to a higher state of alert because of the trouble in the Ukraine. That I've read about Putin, and if Putin has raised his weapons to a higher than normal state of alert, so has Stratcom. And Stratcom raised the weapons to its highest state of alert during 9/11 because no one knew what was happening. Human fallibility, mistakes. So these are the issues to be discussed. What are the factors, human and technological, that could precipitate a nuclear war between Russia and America? And how many times will we come close to nuclear war, and how much longer will our luck hold? 2, what are the ongoing technological and financial developments taking place which are relevant to the nuclear weapons arsenals of both US and America, US and Russia? 3, what problems are associated with lateral proliferation of nuclear weapons via strenuous corporate marketing of nuclear technology? 4, what are the medical and environmental consequences of either a small or large nuclear war? 5, what are the underlying dynamics that have brought life on Earth to the brink of extinction? 6, how can we assess this situation from an anthropological perspective? 7, what is the pathology within the present political situation that could lead us to extinction? 8, how can this nuclear pathology be cured? I'd venture to say that this is probably the most important conference taking place in the United States today, but as Jan Nolan said, she thinks in the world today. Since the Cold War ended, just when the Cold War ended, America agreed with Russia that she would not enlarge NATO to threaten Russia. However, there's a man called Norman Augustine who was the head of Lockheed Martin, and the military corporations when the Cold War ended were a bit desperate because they had no one to sell their weapons to. There was no raison d'etre to build their weapons anymore. And so Norman Augustine decided to visit the NATO countries, and he was supported by many, many people. I have an article here talking about all the corporations who were behind him. And he visited the small little countries, Lithuania, Latvia, etc., and persuaded them to join NATO. Now, to join NATO, you must militarily arm yourself to the tune of several $1 billion, which was always good for Lockheed Martin et al. And they were successful. Of course, they said you can become a democracy, which is absolute rubbish. Look at this country, which claims it's a democracy. And in fact, this country is a socialised country where I think over 60% of the discretionary tax dollar goes to the military-industrial complex and the Pentagon. That's socialism. And the nuclear power industry is socialised too. So the main way that America spends its money is on socialism, and all the little people have to put up with capitalism and fend for themselves. It's a very interesting dichotomy. So these countries were persuaded to join NATO and to militarily arm poor little countries. And also the EU and the IMF persuade them to tighten their belts, and you saw what happened in Greece when you tighten your belts. So what's happened is NATO has enlarged right up to the border of Russia. And you can imagine how America would feel if suddenly Russia decided and announced with Canadian acceptance that Canada was now part of the Russian bloc. We saw it happen when the Russians dared to put some nuclear missiles in Cuba, and we were brought to the brink of extinction at that time. And I knew Robert McNamara, who was in the Oval Office, and he said to me, "Helen, you don't know how close we came to within minutes. We have come to within minutes of nuclear annihilation quite a number of times, and that will be documented by our speakers today and tomorrow." It's interesting, and then we've got the Ukrainian situation, which was orchestrated by the United States. There was a coup. Yanukovych fled, and Poroshenko was put in, who is an American puppet. What's new? A lot of the people who are fighting on the Ukrainian side are ex-Nazis, or in fact Nazis. And so Russia and America are confronting each other militarily for the first time since the Cold War ended. Nothing could be more dangerous. And what I find astonishing is that the New York Times is fostering the myth that it's all Putin's fault. The Crimea has been part of Russia since Catherine the Great. It's their only warm water port. And they had a referendum and the Crimeans wanted to stay with Russia. So the situation is grim. It reminds me of the very primitive arguments during the Cold War. When I first came to America, well, I've been there before, but in 1978, everyone said to me, almost everyone said, "It's better to be dead than red." And I said, "What?" And he said, "We don't want to be communists." And I said, "Well, what about the pygmies in Africa? They don't worry about that." And they said they don't want to be communists too. And I thought, this is a psychotic country, and indeed it was. So I organised with others, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and we held conferences throughout America describing the medical consequences of nuclear war. The first such symposium was held at Harvard, and the reporters there were absolutely perplexed. They said, "What are doctors talking about nuclear war for? This is a political issue." And we said, "No, it's not. It's a medical issue, because nuclear war will create the final epidemic of the human race." And then the bishop or archbishop of Boston, cardinal, whoever, would wake up the next morning, there'd be a map of Boston with the concentric circles of vaporization and third-degree burns and fires, etc. And he'd say, "I don't think Jesus would approve of this." And it happened all over the country, so finally the Catholic bishops got together and wrote a pastoral letter against nuclear war. And then the Methodist bishops got together and they did a similar thing, and their pastoral letter was even better than the Catholic bishops. And eventually we had 1 million people in Central Park in 1982 in June, the biggest rally ever in the history of America. Black lesbians from Harlem, Southern Baptists, Mormons.
And so it goes on. So that was the opening remarks by Helen Caldicott herself. But please go and watch all the presentations that you find interesting, and study, because this is really one of the absolutely best conferences that touches upon the subject. And as you saw, then she did mention the Baltic states, and this is where we are. We are right now in the Baltic states, and we are on the very front line of the Third World War being planned, in the very epicenter. And our neighbor, Lithuania, are planning recruitment of troops from, in a month. They will be recruiting the troops. Official, how do you call that in English? Call for everybody to join into army. That is reinforceable. That is sort of, by law, you have to join it. All the men will have to join army. just because of this threat of war, threat of nuclear war. So what is happening here is that our Lithuanian brothers are leaving Lithuania not to get into these war recruitments. They are leaving the country. It's sort of like a huge immigration process, because otherwise they will grab them, and if they don't go and join the army, then they will be sort of in jail.
Conscription.
Yeah.
That's what it's called.
And so we really see how this is like Naomi Klein is her name, yeah, who has this book, Shock Doctrine. Was that her name?
Naomi Klein.
Yeah. And this is the shock doctrine created by this panic of nuclear war, and how they sort of, through these law structures, they get to our sons and fathers, and they grab them and they put them into these very violent settings, which have had no democratic process at all to be put in place. And this is the New World Order that Pradana Peace Foundation has had a conference on, and this subject we will touch upon tomorrow. And we have to get rid of these structures, these systems that can take our sons and fathers away from us into aggressive mass murder settings. Because war is a criminal mass murder, and for that we are cooperating with Criminalise War Foundation, which also has had a fabulous set of conferences which are on video, which you can follow. And the same thing will happen here in Latvia. They're planning to, what was the name?
Conscription.
Conscript the men since the shift of the years. In autumn it starts. And it's not okay. So we are obviously in the epicenter, and that's why we have to put our zero resources of finance into all of our energy resources to stop the war, both civil and nuclear. And we have to decode these systems then. And I will not go further more on Helen Caldicott, but I will move to Noam Chomsky, who is an American linguist, very eminent scientist with endless row of books written on subjects. But wait, before I do that, I will just return to Helen Caldicott. And this is about very important piece of systemic information, because criminalizing nuclear war as such right now, why isn't it easy to do? There is one obstacle that Helen Caldicott touched upon, and that is how Russia is striving to preserve its independence. And it doesn't feel, and it isn't independent at all, because all of our countries are bound into economical structure of central banking system, because our central banks are subordinate to the previously mentioned Bretton Woods system, and the dollar, the United States dollar. So why does Russia hold to its nuclear weapons, though they have central banking system under the control of United States? Exactly, that's why. Because they are not independent. And so we can't stop nuclear wars without changing the banking system, the monetary system. And the problem with just looking at nuclear war issue is that Russia will not abandon its weapons until they see that the United States are coming after their resources. They don't trust the Western structures and institutions, and the only valid instrument they have to protect themselves is nuclear weapons. So this is why there is this problem with all of this stop nuclear weapons fabulous process, that it might be also a movement for colonization of people. So it is very tricky to see, to decode the systems is very tricky, because we do have to take away the nuclear war risk. But but stopping nuclear war risk has to be done without colonizing the nations. And many of these forces that stop nuclear war risk, are trying to stop nuclear war risk, are paid by the forces that are trying to colonize the last nations trying to not to be colonized, to free themselves from colonizers. I didn't express it very well. Did you get it?
No.
So let's try to make it
Well,
easier.
I don't really think you're right, you see.
No, but this is not... The question is if I make my point understandable. If I'm not right, then you did understand it.
Well, not really. It's only because you said this to me before, and I understood what you said before. But what you're saying now is confusing.
So let's try to say it easy.
I think what you're saying, if I may suggest it, and you can agree with me, is this: that the belief that this is a system where you have two separate independent countries that are moving towards a nuclear war exchange between these countries is an incorrect belief on the surface, because actually both of those countries are controlled by the same overall structure, which is some kind of banking structure that controls both of them. And if that's the case, the question is, how do you explain the fact that if they are controlled by another structure, a sort of invisible structure, that there is a possibility of nuclear war? And that your explanation for that is that the possibility of nuclear war exists because the Russians may at some point decide to rebel against the possibility of them being colonized if they were to give up nuclear weapons, and the only way that they have for doing that is to use nuclear weapons in war.
No, that's not what I meant. I'll try again.
Well, that's what I understood by it.
It's much simpler than that. It's sort of the New World Order is taking over the planet, and this is sort of the last point where some nations who have still some independence have not submitted to the New World Order yet, because they have nuclear weapons. But as soon as the nuclear weapons will be abolished, the New World Order will be total. And after that, actually, it is so powerful, the New World Order, that there will be no next chance to abolish New World Order. Because the systemic matrix of its grid is total. It's computer designed.
Okay, well, that's your... Okay, I think that people can understand what you said there.
Okay. So that's what I mean. So this stopping nuclear war organizations may be funded by New World Order colonizer organizations, and that's what makes it more complicated. That's my point.
Right.
And that's why this conference that we're having here is very important, and we're trying to get the overall view and to find the forces that could be so powerful to decode these sort of...
Well, if this is a discussion and I'm allowed to say something, I don't agree that that's so.
Yeah, but it's not a discussion. So let's go further on. So this is Noam Chomsky's presentation, and he will be talking about nuclear war too in the end. But let's see what he thinks of these colonization systems of trade agreements. The very active issue of TPP.
Free trade agreement that is being signed, and you completely...
Transatlantic agreement?
Yeah, exactly. Could you elaborate on this transatlantic agreement that's being signed between the United States and the European Union?
Well, first of all, we have to remember the 5 filters. It's not a free trade agreement. It has virtually nothing to do with free trade. Virtually nothing. Tariffs do exist, but they're very low, and changing the tariff agreements means essentially nothing. It's a protectionist agreement. It's anti-free trade. Take a look at its... First of all, it's in secret. Remember, it's crucially in secret. The population's not supposed to know about it. Now, it's not totally in secret. The corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing the agreement, it's not secret from them. So it's not secret to the corporate world. It's not secret to the state authority. It's just secret from the population. Already tells you something. Pieces have been leaked, some of it through WikiLeaks. One piece that was leaked was the intellectual property rights section, which is one of the core elements of the agreement. And what are intellectual property rights? That's a complicated word that means highly protectionist measures to ensure the profits, the exorbitant profits of American and international pharmaceutical corporations and media corporations. That's anti-free trade. That's protection, extreme protectionism in the interests of very wealthy and powerful parts of the corporate system. Other parts are called, which we don't have the details of, remember, because it's secret, but looking at other agreements we can guess, are a variety of investor rights provisions to ensure the rights of investors against the population. Take, say, NAFTA, which we do know because it's there, we can see. It was also negotiated in secret, but now it's public. A large part of it is guarantees of the rights of U.S. investors to what's called national treatment in Mexico. So if General Motors invests in Mexico, it has to be treated like a Mexican company. If a Mexican human being comes to New York, he doesn't have the rights of an American citizen. Quite the contrary, he can end up in prison for the rest of his life. But American corporations have to have the rights of Mexican businesses. U.S. agribusiness, highly subsidized agribusiness, totally against free trade, has to have the right to flood the Mexican market with produce that the Mexican campesinos can't compete with, of course. So that sets up what's called a refugee immigration crisis when they're driven off the land and they flee. That's NAFTA. But one of the provisions allows corporation, not a person, not you or me, but it allows a corporation to sue a state if the state is taking measures which might potentially interfere with profits. So if Mexico, say, decides to set up an environmentally protected region where some American corporation wants to invest, they can sue Mexico for taking their profits, their future profits, on the area that Mexico is trying to protect. That's, again, human beings can't do that, corporations can. These are the kinds of provisions that you see in the trade agreements. They're not free trade agreements. They're not about free trade. In fact, to a large extent, they're not about trade at all. And they're certainly not agreements, at least if people are part of their countries. People are mostly opposed to them, which is why they're in secret. So every word in the phrase free trade agreement is just false.
In Germany, there's a lot of grassroots organization taking place around the concept of a basic income guarantee, whereby citizens receive an unconditional sum of money to cover the basic costs such as rent, food, and electricity, etc. Could you provide your assessment on this concept of basic income guarantee?
Basic income guarantee?
Sure.
In Germany and elsewhere. Actually, that's an interesting concept. It comes from the right wing originally. Milton Friedman proposed it, for example. From his point of view, it was part of an effort to undermine welfare state measures. But it doesn't have to have a reactionary component. It can be interpreted as something progressive. People have rights. In fact, if you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, take a look at Article 25. It says people have rights to adequate food, nutrition, health, employment, security, and so on. Those are minimal rights. Any society ought to guarantee that. Well, one way to guarantee it would be through a socially acceptable form of a basic income. In fact, to an extent, that's what so-called welfare states try to provide in a certain way. So sure, that's something that could be proposed. I mean, I don't think it goes far enough, but as a short-term way of alleviating major problems, that's fine. And there are elements in various societies that do provide things like that.
To my last question, could you list some dangers that humanity is facing or is going to face in the 21st century, and what mechanisms are available to the public in order to avoid these catastrophes?
So what dangers are we going to face in the 21st century? And there are two overwhelming dangers, huge shadows looming over everything. The first of them is environmental catastrophe, which is coming. We can debate how long it'll be, but it's coming, and it could be very severe. There are things that can be done about it, but in some places, some things are being done, like, say, Denmark is moving towards some kind of sustainable energy. Germany has plans to move towards a larger degree of sustainable energy, but for the most part, we're just racing towards the cliff that we're going to fall over. It's almost certain that most of the fossil fuels must be left in the ground if we hope to have a decent survival. On the contrary, the energy corporations are trying to exploit every last opportunity to get a drop of oil out of the ground or gas, and they're not being stopped. That's part of the logic of a capitalist market, is that you maximize short-term profit and you don't pay attention to what the consequences are for others and for the future. So that's a huge problem. And things can be done about it, but they're not being done except in limited ways, and that will be real catastrophe for our not very far off for future generations. The other major shadow is nuclear war. That should not be underestimated. We've come very close to nuclear war repeatedly. A nuclear war is essentially a terminal disaster. It's something that survived, but not much. And we've come close. There are serious dangers right now. We know how to, in theory, we know how to eliminate them, but we're not doing it. In fact, the nuclear programs are being expanded. U.S. program is being expanded by about $1 trillion over the coming decades. But there's serious crises in Ukraine and the Middle East, elsewhere, that could break into nuclear war. These are major problems. In the background is another problem. It's not a problem of survival, but it's a problem of minimal decency. And that is the neoliberal assault against the global population that's been going on now for a generation. It's having different effects in different places, almost always deleterious. Now, a few places have been able to begin to extricate themselves from it. One of the most important is South America. And for the first time in 500 years, South America has begun to extricate itself from Western imperial control last century. That means U.S. control, and to unify, to develop internal organizations that exclude Western domination, to face some of its tremendous internal problems. The U.S. has been almost driven out of most of the hemisphere, which is a remarkable change in world affairs. And partly they're reacting to the neoliberal assault, which was quite devastating in South America. They actually followed the rules and suffered.
So, thank you to Noam Chomsky. So, this was really fabulous. So, South America is getting liberated. Isn't that something? He said it's sort of in thousands of years, for 1,000 years, it's the first time when they are really making progress of liberation. And that's why I truly believe that this is possible. It is already done in South America in many ways, and we will just deepen it. And thank you very much for this session. And now we will have a dinner break, and we will be back. See you again.